Well, thank you all for coming to our session, co-sponsored by the Foreign Policy Initiative and Freedom House. My name is Bob Kagan. I'm a board member on Foreign Policy Initiative and a fellow at the Brookings Institution. I have to say it's very gratifying to see so many of you here. It's a packed house, standing room only, because, of course, this is an extremely important issue. Today's conference is going to feature two keynote speeches by two of the leading members of the U.S. Congress on this and on many other issues, Senator Ben Cardin, Senator Kelly Ayotte, as well as a panel featuring very distinguished guests who have made the cause of freedom in Russia their primary issue, both obviously former Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Kasyanov and the leading member of the European Parliament, Kristiina Ojuland, have really dedicated themselves to this, and that panel will be moderated by Freedom House President and good friend of mine, David Kramer. Let me just say a few words about this issue, which I do think is very important. Perhaps you all know that as we are meeting today, I think it was just yesterday, there was some tremendous progress made in moving forward on the legislation that Senator Cardin has sponsored with many others, bipartisan support called known as the Magnitsky legislation, which addresses the very important issue of human rights in Russia and may stand to replace, if all works as I think it ought to, the Jackson-Vanik Amendment that was passed back in 1974. People talk about human rights as somehow distinct from our basic strategic interests. You often hear that we look after human rights because, as Senator Kerry said yesterday, it's in our DNA. It's just we have no choice but to be interested in human rights. But separately from that are the pursuit of our basic foreign policy interests. I think that's a mistake to view things in that way. I think that the issue of human rights throughout American history has also been tightly linked to our strategic and foreign policy interests. And another thing that's been in our DNA since the founding of the nation was this understanding that you can see in the writing of the founders, you can see it in the statements of Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan, George Kennan, for that matter, that the nature of another government has a tremendous impact on the nature of their foreign policy. And dictatorships have certain kinds of foreign policy qualities, and most Americans throughout history have understood that the better friends, the safer allies, the safer members of the international community have always been liberal democracies and not dictatorships. And I think we can see very clearly in the case of Russia that the nature of the regime affects the nature of Russian, or in the past, Soviet foreign policy. A hardline Soviet regime at home tended to produce a belligerent and aggressive Soviet foreign policy. When we saw Mikhail Gorbachev move toward glasnost and perestroika, it was also part and parcel of an opening to the West. And during the Yeltsin years, bumpy as they were, we found foreign ministers and a foreign policy of Yeltsin that sought to embrace the West, that sought to integrate Russia with the West. In Putin's Russia, I think it's pretty clear that Putin's concern for maintaining control at home has an impact on how he deals with the United States and Europe and other democratic nations abroad. He's so concerned about another color revolution, only this time in Russia, that he directs most of his anger and concern and Russian nationalism westward toward Europe and toward the United States. If you think in strategic terms, that seems absurd. Russia has China on its east, Central Asia and radical Islam to its south, and Putin tells the Russian people that the greatest threat is coming from NATO. But that is a domestic issue. And so, just to sum up, I think it's important that we realize that when we address the issue of human rights in Russia, we are not only doing what's right given our values, we're also doing something that's very profoundly in American interests. We have a real interest, both in terms of our economic engagement with Russia and our strategic interests in seeing a Russia that is more open, that is less corrupt, that is less brutal at home, because it will exhibit those qualities as well overseas. So, having said that, it's a great honor for me to be here to introduce Senator Ben Cardin, who's been a leading member of Congress both in the House and the Senate for many years, and I have to say is one of my heroes because of the work that he's done. I must say, if Scoop Jackson is looking down from whatever heaven he is in, he sees in Senator Cardin a true successor. And what Senator Cardin has done to champion this legislation, which addresses the broad issue of human rights, as a successor to the work that Senator Jackson did, I think is truly commendable, and we're honored to have Senator Cardin with us here today. Thank you very much, Senator.
Bob, thank you for that very, very kind introduction. To be compared with Scoop Jackson is quite a tribute, quite an honor, so I thank you very much. And let me thank you for holding this forum towards a democratic Russia. I think it's absolutely essential that we talk about Russia. I want to thank Freedom House. I want to thank the Foreign Policy Initiative for putting this together, and thank you all for being here. What an incredible turnout. We have to get a larger room for you next time. That's good. David Kramer, who was a former member of the Helsinki Commission and very actively involved on the human rights agenda, bringing the administration and Congress together on human rights issues. I thank David for his help and leadership as we marshaled the Magnitsky bill through the Foreign Relations Committee, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But first, I want to underscore the point that Bob made as far as Russia is concerned. We have an incredible strategic interest in Russia. We are the United States, Russia, the two leading nuclear powers in the world. We have a responsibility to move this nation, move our continent, move our world towards a more safe societies, to rid ourselves of the threat of nuclear confrontation. Russia and the United States needs to work together on that. We have common interest in many regions of the world. We should be together on Syria. We should be together on so many other the strategic problems around the world. So we have a real interest to build a stronger relationship between the United States and Russia. We are 2 of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations. We need to work together in a close way to advance peace and prosperity around the world. But it's very difficult to do that in the type of closeness we need without there being a democratic Russia. And that's been our concern, is to tell a country that's important and relevant to us that we want to help them and assist them in understanding their commitments internationally towards human rights. And that's the reason we raise these issues. The Commission for Security and Cooperation in Europe, now known as the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, was formed in 1975 under that premise, Bob, that security cannot be achieved without advancements on human rights and economic security. You need to have all three. And yes, Russia has a strong military presence. We understand that. They're a very significant country. They need to continue to make advancements on human rights. Instead, we find under President Putin an administration that appears to be moving in the wrong direction on the human rights and democratic front. And that it should not be acceptable to us, and it should not be acceptable to the Russian people. We hear that President Putin says, give us time, be patient. Well, in many cases, when you ask for time and patience and you talk and don't act, it's an effort to avoid and move in the wrong direction. And we see that happening in Russia today. Human rights, there shouldn't be patience in advancing human rights. We should all demand that these progress be made. So I want to talk a moment about how we perceive moving forward on the human rights agenda with Russia, engaging the international community, not trying to do this ourselves, and trying to engage Russia itself. And I think you're all familiar with the tragedy of Sergei Magnitsky, a 37-year-old lawyer who was representing in a company, And in that effort, American company, in that effort, discovered that there was widespread corruption that was preventing him from representing his client and also affecting the country he loved. So he found it an obligation to let the authorities know about the corruption that he discovered in the course of his representation. And as a result of his whistleblowing as to the corruption that was widespread in his community, he was arrested. He was arrested without charges, basically. He was sent to prison, and he was tortured. He was in need of medical attention. A doctor was literally outside of the prison cell, not allowed to see Sergei Magnitsky, and he died in prison a little over 2 years ago as a result of these incredible abuses of his rights. The people who were responsible, and there have been investigations that have been done, and we know the people who were responsible, that's without dispute. The people who are responsible not only for the initial corruption, but also for his imprisonment, his torture, and the cover-up afterwards, are well known. And those individuals have not been held accountable. To the contrary, these individuals have been promoted and been given honors and have been rewarded for their corrupt activities. That cannot allowed to continue. It's not a cause just in the United States. It's a cause also in Russia. It's a cause also in countries around the world, that we cannot allow that type of human rights violations to go without accountability. So where should the accountability be? It should be in Russia. Russia should take action. They should rid their society of corruption, and they should hold people who have violated the trust of the Russian people and who have violated the rights of the Russian citizens. They should be held accountable for their actions. And the fruits of their corruption should be available to the Russian people. They should not be allowed to be hidden and used for the personal gain of those who have perpetrated these human rights violations. That's where the Magnitsky Bill comes in. The Magnitsky Bill builds on that premise, and it says to those who have perpetrated gross human rights violations that we're not going to let you take your profits and take them to America. After all, they don't really want their money in rubles. They would like to have them in euros or dollars, and more recently, I think dollars and euros. So I think that's where they want to keep their money. And we had evidence that some of the people involved in the Magnitsky tragedies have had their money in U.S. banking accounts. They also like to visit America. Some of their family members are in America. They go to school in America, and they want to come here. But what we can do is deny them the privilege of visiting America by denying them visas, and we can deny them the opportunity to use our banking system by freezing assets that they may put into the American banking system. And if other countries follow the U.S. leadership, then you're effectively cutting off much of what the gains could be from their corrupt activities. That's what the Magnitsky Bill is about. Its objective is kind of simple. Its objective is to get Russia to act. We want Russia to hold their violators accountable. We want Russia to be a democratic state. We want Russia to respect basic human rights. For many of the reasons, first, as Senator Kerry said, it's in our DNA. It's true. This is part of our values, and we think these are universal values. It's part of our DNA. It's part of our national security agenda. We want stable regimes. We want countries that we can trade with on a reliable basis. We want countries who have valuable resources for those resources to be available in a stable way internationally. That's why we are concerned about the Middle East, and we want stable regimes. We may have had strategic partners. Bork was president of Egypt, but it was not a stable country, as we saw, because it didn't respect human rights. It didn't have democratic procedures. We want, for the purposes of stability, we want to see countries respect the rights of their citizens and establish democratic principles. So it's in our interest to get Russia to change. It's not to penalize the perpetrators. That's not our objective. Our objective is to get the type of changes in Russia that we think are important for the Russian people and for the international community. And that's the objective of the Magnitsky legislation. Now, we have a real opportunity to move this bill forward, as was pointed out, because this is also the time that Russia is entering the World Trade Organization, the WTO. And the Jackson-Vanik laws that were passed in the 1970s, they were passed as a statement of human rights for America, that we didn't want to do normal trade relations with a country that denied its citizens the right to leave their country, emigrate from their country to another country. And it was aimed at the Soviet Union, no question about it. The Soviet Union was the nation denying its citizens the right to emigrate, although the bill was global in its application. It applied to any non-market economy. And it had a major effect for its day. It did put a spotlight on the abusive practices of the former Soviet Union in denying the right of its own citizens to emigrate, which is a basic international human right. And we were able to get countries to change as a result of Jackson-Vanik. But it also showed the world that the United States was prepared to lead. And I must tell you, it was the United States that said, we will use trade to put a spotlight on the apartheid government of South Africa, and we will deny South Africa trade with the United States as long as it is an apartheid government. And the rest of the world said, gee, maybe we shouldn't use trade. It hurts the people of the country. It's not a polite thing to do. Why don't we just talk about it and have forums and have meetings, but don't take action such as denying trade to the country? We said no. We said we have to use the tools that are available. We use trade. The rest of the world followed the U.S. leadership. And as you know, South Africa changed its government with a minimal amount of bloodshed. So U.S. leadership is critically important internationally. There are countries in Europe today that are watching what's happening in the United States on the Magnitsky Bill. They're going to follow. They won't lead, but they will follow. And we need to show that leadership. So one of the important lessons of Jackson-Vanik was that the United States needs to lead. Now, Jackson-Vanik, I think most would acknowledge, is no longer relevant to the current challenges of human rights globally. So that is why this is a fitting substitute or change from the Jackson-Vanik laws to move towards the Magnitsky laws that say basically that human rights violators, there will be penalties imposed if they're not held accountable by their own country, penalties that we control ourselves, the right to visit and the right to use our banking system. As I indicated before, the Jackson-Vanik law was initiated because of activities within the Soviet Union. The Magnitsky law has been initiated because of activities within the Russian Federation. But we do believe it should be global. This is not aimed at one country. I understand our objective in this forum is to get a democratic Russia. Absolutely. But we can use this also to advance international standards. And that's why one of the reasons that we feel pretty passionately about this being global in its effect. We hear frequently from those who say, well, aren't we just meddling into the internal affairs of another country? I would hope that that has been discredited by now, those types of statements. I can point to the fact that Russia is a signatory of the OSCE, and in the OSCE, they agreed to certain basic rights, and in that document, any other signatory state can question the activities of what's going on in another member state. So the United States has every right to challenge what's happening in the Russian Federation. We're both signatories to the OSCE. Or I could just mention the basic human rights issues are global in nature, and then any country has the right to challenge another country's violation of internationally established human rights standards. Not what the United States thinks is right, is what we believe are global standards for advancing human rights. We are making progress on this bill. It did receive a favorable report, a unanimous vote in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee yesterday. As a standalone bill, the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee has indicated that he will be combining this bill with the PNTR vote, which is necessary for Russia to enter the World Trade Organization. So I think we will get a pretty clean vote on this issue. And I must tell you, the last point I want to mention on this One of the reasons we do this is to help the Russian people. I have received numerous contacts from members of the citizens of Russia, from members of the Duma, who have said that Russia can do better than they're doing today, and that we're right to challenge what happened to Magnitsky. So this is important for the people of Russia to see their country do better, which we know that they can. I tell you, coming to this room and seeing it overflowed with people give me optimism that we will achieve these objectives. One of my major concerns is whether we have enough of a focus on the human rights side. There's a lot of focus on the national military side. There's a lot of focus on economic development issues, but are we focusing on the human rights side? And quite frankly, one of the struggles here is to get our own State Department to focus more on human rights. I applaud Secretary of State Clinton. I think she is focused on human rights. And I congratulate her on her leadership in raising these issues around the world. But we are dealing with a large federal agency, the Department of State, that has agendas throughout the world. And I think we need to elevate the importance of human rights in the State Department. I'm told, why do we need this bill? After all, the State Department today has the authority to deny visas to those who violate human rights, and they do. It took a year and a half, over a year and a half, after the tragedy, for the State Department to take action on the Magnitsky perpetrators, and they only did that because of the spotlight that Congress put on this issue. So it's important that we institutionalize this in order to be able to show our leadership and to show that this is not just a fad of the moment, but a real legacy of what we want to do to advance human rights. Seeing you all here interested in this subject give me hope that we will indeed elevate the importance of human rights, which will add to the security of America and to global security. Thank you very much for having this forum. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Great. Senator, thanks so much. And let me just echo Bob's admiration that he mentioned before. Your persistence and determination to see this bill through, I think, is really starting to pay off. And I do see the end in sight. Yesterday's vote by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I think, was a critical step. The House Foreign Affairs Committee's action a few weeks ago was also a very favorable development. I really do think that we're going to see this come to fruition. So many thanks for all your efforts, and thanks for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very grateful to my colleagues at the Foreign Policy Initiative for co-hosting today's event, and I'm grateful for the tremendous turnout here this morning. I also have the privilege of introducing two very special guests here. Mikhail Kasyanov, whom Bob mentioned, former Prime Minister of Russia, now one of the leading opposition figures and head of Parnas, and Kristiina Ojuland from the European Parliament, originally from Estonia, been in the European Parliament, I think, since 2009, and a key figure on the Foreign Affairs Committee and focused on human rights in particular. So it's a great privilege for us to be able to hear from you. I also, I don't think he's here anymore. I did see him in the back before. Bill Browder, the head of Hermitage Capital, was here earlier. I do want to recognize Bill's efforts because it is his determination as well in trying to make sure that the Justice for Magnitsky Act comes to light. It's his efforts that I think really paid off, working very closely with us at Freedom House and with members of Congress. I do want to pay tribute to Bill's very hard work on this and trying to see justice for, as he says, his lawyer who was killed in Russia. I want to start the discussion, and I do want to get not everyone involved in the audience, but a lot of you with questions. But I want to start by focusing on the Magnitsky situation and then broaden it to a larger discussion about toward a democratic Russia. And Mikhail, let me start with you. Today, the Deputy Foreign Minister in Moscow, Sergei Ryabkov, expressed outrage about the passage yesterday in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, saying that Russia would respond with even harsher measures. what will it do? What do you think is going to happen in Moscow? What's going to be the reaction there?
I don't think just something special happened, just which could create troubles to Americans or other people. But the important thing is that this piece of legislation focuses and touches exactly the core points of the regime. Those people, those bureaucrats involved in torture and death of Magnitsky would understand now just that is not anymore Mr. Putin could defend them from any I would say, pressure from outside. And those measures which this legislation will introduce will not necessarily just focus only on visa ban and accounts, but also a so-called blacklist. And people everywhere, and in Russia in particular, would know that these people included in the blacklists. And they punished internationally. That's an important moral piece of legislation. That is moral act as individual sanctions. That's why there's completely different story compared with the Jackson-Vanik amendment, which focused on sanctions against the nation, against the country, and just taking out Russia out of application of Jackson-Vanik and introducing Magnitsky bill. That's important change in the whole, and I would say in the whole relationship between the Russian Federation and the United States. And as Senator Cardin have just mentioned, that is human rights, that's universal values. And Russia and all Russian governments taken obligations to fulfill and to fulfill those human rights, to defend human rights internally and externally. And they agree that these universal values not internal matter anymore. That's why any other participating countries of OECD agreement have a right to challenge those situations. And that is the case we have now in Russia. That's why all those harsh reaction, that is some kind of Soviet-style reaction, not understanding how nations interact in 21st century. That's why just I'm a little bit disappointed that government of my country behaves so unresponsibly in an inappropriate manner.
Let me push you a little more. Some members of the Federation Council have said, in fact, Russia should not respond if the Magnitsky bill is passed. There are members in the Duma who have said, on the contrary, Russia should respond even more forcefully. Do you have anything in mind on what exactly they might do other than ban some people from visiting Moscow, or for the very few people who might keep money there?
I think not issuing visas. That's the only actual fact. But I don't think just Americans have their rubles in Russian Sberbank. I don't think, or are there any banks?
I don't know.
You have,
No, I don't. I don't. No, hold on.
And
let the record show.
That's the main point you're asking, consistently asking this question. Sorry, David.
I do not.
But the time comes.
Yeah, well.
Sooner or later we come to such a
Yeah, that would be a
situation
big
that
change.
you will have a reason to have rubles in your account in Moscow, definitely.
Right.
I hope this time will come.
But let me last part on this, and then I'm going to turn to Kristiina. Cooperation on Afghanistan, working together on Iran, the Northern Distribution Network, arms control. Are all those things going to come to a screeching halt because of passage of this bill?
I don't think so, absolutely not, because just, in fact, Mr. Putin and his people, or his team, as he say, they're interested in a very particular, I would say, reaction. Just they would like the people abroad, or leaders, foreign leaders, would recognize them as a legitimate president, as a legitimate power, which in fact not. Because those elections which we had in December and in March, they couldn't be viewed as free elections, couldn't be viewed as fair elections, and not credible. That's why just they see the lack of legitimacy internally. And sociological polls already show that more than 50% of population cannot see this power as legitimate power. That's why just Putin badly needs external sources of legitimacy. That's why I think just this global reaction of those international security issues like Afghanistan and Iran, although they don't behave appropriately, I would say responsibly, but that is the issues which will continue to be important points. And I wish at least this government I am totally against will perform in appropriate manner. And that's I would say on some international issues, they continue to respect international obligations. For instance, recently there was a restoration of registration of political party, Parnas, a Republican Party. Yeah, because just European Court of Human Rights made a decision that liquidation of this party was illegal. And Putin just taken this decision because we are members of Council of Europe. Not only OSCE, but also Council of Europe. And just they had to implement this decision of European Court of Human Rights. It means just it's not totalitarian regime yet. That's why we still have a hope to press the regime within the constitution and to change the regime through free elections. That's the reason, and that's the main goal of opposition now, just peacefully to press this authority and to put them in a position to implement constitution and to arrange free elections under control of civil society, but not under control of FSB or other secret services, as happened before. That's what. Sorry, that's why just I think just a general attitude for international issues continue to be important, and I don't think just they will ignore that or will perform contrary. Although of course some kind of trading they're dreaming about trading on such important issue like Syria, what we have now, just absolutely inappropriate. Just it's not a responsible, serious position of the government, being a nuclear power, being a permanent member of Security Council, and in fact, I'm very much disappointed that the government of my country behaves this way these days.
Kristiina, let me turn to you, and sticking with the Magnitsky legislation, if we can, for a few more minutes. Maybe if you could give us a status report on where things stand. I know the European Parliament, you and Guy Verhofstadt in particular, have been real leaders on trying to move this forward. Where do things stand, both within the European Parliament, and where do you think things stand within some individual nation states' parliaments?
Well, thank you, David. And well, anyway, thank you very much for this invitation and allowing to be here with you and sharing the views. And I'm very, very pleased to see that so many people, and especially young people, are here in this hall. Thank you for your interest. So, well, in the European Parliament, actually, we started the Magnitsky discussion already 2 years ago. And in fact, first we voted in 2010 on the proposal to the Council of Ministers of member countries to take Magnitsky, so-called Magnitsky list into their agenda with a purpose to oppose the visa sanctions in that time. Unfortunately, the European governments did not pick up this proposal from the European Parliament, and this is, so to say, it was postponed. And now, earlier this year, in spring, the European Liberal and Democratic Group in the European Parliament, which is not a liberal group in American terms, but in European terms, it's a more center-right political group, not a communist at all. And it's by size, it is the number 3 group in European Parliament. As you said, yes, our group leader, Mr. Guy Verhofstadt, who used to be a Belgian prime minister for 9 years, now he's our group leader, and myself, we signed the initiative as a recommendation to the Council of Ministers again to start the process, the so-called Magnitsky process, but started in similar circumstances like US Congress has been dealing. That means that not only concentrating anymore on those concrete persons who were guilty in Magnitsky's death, but now it is much broader, and it comes to the broader well, criminal persons who are involved in torture, who are involved in violations of human rights in Russia or in corruption, and etc. And it's also consists not only visa sanctions anymore, but also we are also considering the sanctions on assets. So, and now this proposal was picked up by the Foreign Affairs Committee of the European Parliament. We start our first discussion already in 2 weeks' time, in the mid of July. We shall have the first reading. And then after summer break, we will come back to the issue in the committee with the purpose to have a final vote in the committee, and then we will take this proposal to the plenary. But still, there is one thing what I'd like to share with you, that the procedure is different in Europe than here, that the European Parliament does not have the full power to have a final decision upon this piece of legislative proposal. It's just the recommendation to the Council of Ministers what the European Parliament can vote in the plenary, and then again it will depend of the member countries' governments how they will proceed this proposal. But one very important moment what I'd also like to add is that it's very, very important what the US Congress has been doing, and I personally believe that it is very much encouraging for the European governments also to go through the similar legislation, and here I also like to say that we really must work together between US and Europe on this very issue, because Russia is both of us a very, very important partner, and as Senator Cardin said, we need Russia, which is democratic, which shares the same values with us. Otherwise, it's very difficult to imagine to build up the partnership, and even more if we are speaking about the strategic partnership, then how can you have this partnership without sharing the same values?
Is it correct to say that if one Schengen zone member in the EU were to pass this legislation, all the other Schengen zone members would have to abide by it because of the visa policy? And if that's the case, where do you see the best chances of getting this legislation passed in member states?
Yes, you're right. This is the case, and this has been also experienced in practice in Europe. And exactly that was the case, by the way, in Estonia, as Estonia is a member of the Schengen Treaty, the common visa system in Europe. And then a couple of years ago, we sanctioned one of the Russian Duma members with a visa. Right. And automatically all Schengen members, but also you should know that not all 27 members of EU are members of Schengen, like UK, for example. It does not belong to Schengen, or Cyprus. So,
some of the new Romania, I think, in both.
Yes, the new countries, right. But I was saying, yes, that if one country is doing this, it has been in practice, experienced, and that's the way, yes, how it should work.
Is there the Dutch Parliament last year, I think it was almost a year ago exactly, passed a unanimous resolution in support of this legislation, but the Dutch government hasn't followed up on it. Do you see any prospects with the Netherlands or with other countries where there's some real promise that this could pass in a member state in say, this year?
Well, it's very difficult to predict what the member countries' governments are thinking, because still European Union is a union of sovereign countries with their own governments, sovereign governments with their own political systems, and it's much more complicated than here in US. Once you make a decision, then it will be implemented from the part of the whole country as a federal country. Europe is not a federation; it's not a federal union so far, and therefore it's really very, very much in the hands of the national governments and also in their parliaments. Also, the national parliaments are playing an important role in Europe so far.
Okay, Mikhail, let me come back to you. You're now a leading member of the opposition, but you were the prime minister in the beginning of the Putin presidency.
And?
What happened? Что случилось?
Yeah, that's unexpected things. In fact, just, you remember that Mr. Putin, in fact, already 4 terms in power, 3, and they started the 4th one. In fact, just he was first term when he was elected by a slight majority, like 52% in the year 2000. I think that was the only elections when he was elected. He was elected because Mr. Yeltsin president supported him in full and just provided him all authority even earlier than elections. And that's why just at that time people connected hopes for changes in Russia and supported Putin because, first of all, he promised to fight terrorism and the Northern Caucasus, and that time were the war in Chechnya and Dagestan. And secondly, he was publicly demonstrated publicly that he was devoted to democratic principles of democracy in general terms and economy in particular. And at that time, Mr. Yeltsin, President Yeltsin, supported him and believed. And me too. I was finance minister during Yeltsin period. But then Mr. Putin invited me just to walk with him together. After his elections as a prime minister, and I accepted, subject to his support of reforms, which, from my perspective, Russia badly needed at that time, and I listed to him just those reforms, and he promised to support, and in fact, he implemented his support during these 4 years we worked together. Just only few things appeared at that time, just discouraging or disturbing me at that time. And last year, some kind of disagreements, public disagreements, appeared between us. For instance, in terms of Russian policy towards Ukraine or Belarus, or just pressure on Yukos and Khodorkovsky and Lebedev in particular, or just his ignoration of support of the reform of the gas sector in Russia, which is a crucial one. And then, after my departure, in the beginning of 2004, just a year after, or just less than a year after, the national tragedy in Beslan happened. Maybe you remember, just massive killings of children. And that was cynically used by Mr. Putin just to change the overall policy, internally and externally. During our joint work in the year 2000-2004, maybe everyone can recall just how relations between Russia and the United States and other Western countries improved. Because as a result of national strategy here on 9/11 in the United States, Russia responded immediately with full support of those actions. And we provided all necessary support to travel to Afghanistan and to provide all those necessary military cargoes there. And in fact, Russia became already just, I wouldn't say associated member, but already was a special committee was established, Russia-NATO committee. And people started to say that maybe in the future Russia will join NATO as a full-fledged member. And that was a real cooperation. And then suddenly a global change appeared to be in the fall 2004. And Mr. Putin decided to change the overall policy. And he said Russia surrounded by enemies. And those enemies dream about Russian resources and to deprive Russia of its sovereignty and to take our oil and gas, etc., etc. And all these stupid propaganda that started to appear in television. And then just by adoption of new laws, just the whole political environment was squeezed. All human rights organizations were named as foreign spies. Just all parties was forcefully re-registered, and only 7 out of 40 parties just were left. Those who promised to Mr. Putin to follow his policy. And then since that time, all institutions, all features of a democratic state were effectively abolished by Mr. Putin. Just we have, since that time, during this 6-year period of time, we don't have separation of power, we don't have independent judiciary, and we don't have free media, and recently we lost the most important institute of democratic state, free elections. That's why Russia today is not a democratic nation at all, not a democratic state. There is no single feature which could demonstrate that in Russia a democracy exists. Everything is imitation. Elections, that's imitation. Free media is imitation, a part of a couple of radio stations with overall coverage not more than 1 million listeners. And imitation that there is a parliament, which simply stamping within 3 days just any initiative of president or of the government at all, as a general. That's why today we have an imitated state, imitated democracy. That's why such strategy like Magnitsky could happen in my country, unfortunately, because the total ignoration of human rights and so-called state priorities, state interest, which is on top of any other interest, which is human rights. And Russia, as everyone today mentioned, is a full-fledged member of OSCE and the Council of Europe, where those values just written down explicitly. And Russia agreed to recognize that as international matters, but not internal. That's why happened so that Mr. Putin appeared to be pretended that he was a Democrat, devoted to democratic principles, but it appeared to be late in 2004 and 2005, and today in particular, that he was and he continued to be a KGB style agent, officer, and that's why the Soviet style of understanding how nations interact in this world continue to be the case, and people around him think the same way. That's why Russia is in trouble now. The government is a sick government, and Russian people just conservated and its development. And economy depend on oil price even more. And for the first time in recent Russian history, the federal budget formed for more than 50% of revenue coming from oil and gas exports, which is absolute dependence on international markets. It means fragility of the finance system increased dramatically. That's why people already just saying every day, if oil price fall down to $60 per barrel, just that social collapse inevitable. That's right. And that's why Putin just tries to squeeze further the whole environment. Although everything changes in the country, and just massive protests took place during the last 6 months, and in fact, people are waking up, and that's why I think just general changes are inevitable. The point is just how far Putin can go with the pressing opposition, and whether he recognized that necessity of building up an exit strategy is necessary, or just if he continues the same policy, we could see just in a couple of years, I would say, direct revolutionary developments, which we don't want as my party, People's Freedom Party. We don't want, we are against revolution, and we try to press authority peacefully and to have a transformation in accordance with our constitution and to stand on those values Russian people devoted to adopting a constitution of normal democratic state. That's why just today, difficult period.
Let me personalize the question a little bit, if I can. Okay. What was the tipping point for you personally? Many people assumed it was the arrest of Khodorkovsky. Was that, in fact, the final, the expression in English is the straw that broke the camel's back, the last point. And the other part of the question is, why did you decide not to just go live comfortably somewhere in Russia or in the West? Why did you decide to take up a leading opposition role?
In fact, frankly, I didn't want to come back to politics just after my departure from the government. I started doing business, but then, and I understood, of course, and recognized that Putin, Mr. Putin is just not the right president, but making mistakes, but those mistakes could be improved in the future. But as I mentioned later in the end of 2004 and 2005, he changed the overall policy. And as I already described, the whole political environment was squeezed. And for me, it appeared to be very clear what he wants. He wants the total control and unchangeable power, unchangeable government in general terms. And that's why that was the final turning point when he asked me to come, because Mr. Putin wanted me just to somehow to cooperate with his government, just building up an international bank, just Russia, European Union, and I answered to them that I stop all relations with your government, I go to my own. And just 2 months after, just I announced that I come back to politics, now just in terms of in the role of opposition. And I form a new party, and since that time we 3 times wanted to participate in elections, and all 3 times during 6-year period the government denied registration contrary to our obligations, so, and I mean international and laws. And only now, as I mentioned, just our party has been registered as a result of implementation of decision of European Court of Human Rights. That's how just I came to such a position, and for me that's absolutely clear. I cannot live just quietly when I was a prime minister in my country and just to a certain extent responsible for what is taking place now, because just my government and my reforms of my government just put Russia on sustainable growth, and for 9 years we were just a growing nation. And today we have better conditions than it was in the year 1998 or 1999. And the economy grew considerably with the rate of 7% per year before the crisis of 2008. And the revenue of people increased by 15% annually. And in fact, for many people, especially in big cities, people understood that's already new life. And now just they're already building up their futures. And now, just the protest movement mostly stay in big cities, where people just in the internet, and people can travel, not everyone, but can travel abroad and see just how just life is taking place there, and what is the relationship between policeman and a citizen on the street, and compare what they have in Russia. And they know just how to do business. In Russia, just everything is corrupted. The corruption is climbing just on a level just none of living generations in Russia just ever seen this before. That's why that's important. That's important to understand what is the nature of this protest. That's middle class. In fact, there is no revolution in Russia, and it is not possible at the moment, because those 100,000 people in the street of Moscow, that's middle class. People coming in their nice cars, just with their computers and a nice clothes, because just they fight for their rights. They have something to eat, they have jobs, they have good salaries, but they cannot quietly just keep patience what's taking place in our country. But if this Putin's policy continue to this middle class, other groups of social groups will join, like poor young people in the suburbs of big cities, who are jobless and have no hope just to get education and have no hope to get jobs. And for them, nothing to lose. And that's how just usually revolution starts. We have 1 year, maybe 2 years before that. That's what my party just tries to explain to Mr. Putin. I mean, just through our political activity, through our protests and our political actions. That is, the situation couldn't continue, couldn't stay as it is. So that to have a peaceful transformation, free elections, that's the only way. That's what our demand is, and the general demand of those resolutions adopted on the massive protest in Moscow just provide that. We demand early elections, free elections on the new rules to negotiate on a round table, and new early elections under new rules, not old Putin's when he choosing those with whom he would like to imitate or just imitate that competition takes place. There is no political competition in Russia right now, but we need that. And only in this case we can have a peaceful transformation and in accordance with the Constitution.
Kristiina, in the West, Europe and the United States, people had placed a lot of hope in Dmitry Medvedev, a name you don't hear very often anymore. Did we just completely misread and misunderstand the situation in Russia? As long as Putin was there, Russia was never going to be able to move in a more democratic direction. And is the problem Putin, or is it much broader than that?
Well, yes, in the beginning, I would say in the term in office of President Putin, I share that, yes, the West had high expectations, and especially Europe, when we were talking about the modernization, partnership for modernization, which was initiated with the European, not only proposal, but very much, yes, in cooperation. But I think that after a couple of years, when we show that there is a lot of discussion and talks and promises, but not delivery, then it was clear that it was just a sort of fake policy, just perhaps even too foolish West. Yes, there is some sort of modernization in certain areas in Russia, in industry, and once again, it's a lot of joint programs with the European Union in certain fields, but after 5 years in office of President Medvedev, we all witnessed that the modernization of the country cannot take place if there is not democracy, if there is not existing rule of law, if there is a daily basis human rights violations. That means that any country can be modernized without taking on board these core values. And I'm sorry, but in my view, it has been a failure. We should not accuse ourselves that much in the West because once again, I think that in the beginning we sincerely wanted to participate and to help Russia and President Medvedev to get through this modernization. But perhaps Mikhail knows better the reasons why it was not implemented. But if I may, to make one more remark on what Mikhail was telling about the opposition in Russia. Another very important point in my view is from the West to support Russian opposition leaders and those civil society people who are now fighting for democracy. And I'm saying so because I'm coming myself from Estonia, the country which was occupied for 50 years. And when I graduated university, it was 1990, and still the Soviet Union was existing. But what was important and encouraging for our people during the occupation was exactly the fact that the West did not give up talking about a non-recognition policy of occupation, especially with the leadership of US. West did not give up to talk about the restoration of democracy and human rights and rule of law and other values. That was so important in that time for our nations, like Baltic countries and other countries in Europe who lived in totalitarian regime under the totalitarian regimes. And now, if I may make a parallel with the current Russia, then it's clear that Putin's regime has become an autocratic regime. Already, this is broadly defined, at least in Europe, as an autocracy and autocratic regime. And therefore, those people in Russia who are fighting on daily basis for democracy, they need our support. And they need not only the support from the government side, which is also very important, but these people, these ordinary people in Russia, they need also the support from our civil societies. And for example, through the movement of Helsinki committees, which was very important during the Soviet times and during the Cold War. So I think it's exactly a very important time to refresh the Helsinki committee movements in order to support our friends, Democrats and civil society in Russia and some other countries definitely who need this.
Mikhail, criticism of the opposition focuses largely on the fact that you guys can't get your act together. You can't come together. You can't unite. You're your own worst enemies. You're always fighting with each other. The protests that we saw in December and February, March, didn't really have a leader. Is that a good thing? Is that a weakness on the part of the opposition? And what will it take to come together? Or is this a misunderstanding? Are you more united than the perception in the West?
In fact, it depends on the goals opposition has. If we're talking about the peaceful democratic transformation, it means we are fighting for political competition and we're fighting for free elections. And therefore, we don't need just united opposition. We don't need to be nationalists and liberals and, say, communists to be united. We need political competition, and all of those groups just have the right to represent the views of one or another social group. But just how the country would be ruled, governed by whom, just elections could result. That's why just we believe that there is no need for that. Talking about Democrats, I mean, just those people, center-right, center-left, I think just center-right already united, and now a new party, People's Freedom, Republican People's Freedom Party, that is unity of three smaller political parties, and in fact, that's what we already have. But on the streets, in fact, the de facto, just the protest coalition, white coalition already exists. Because just all of us, communists and even nationalists and us, we are together and on the same street, on the same square, on the same stage, just demanding free elections. That's an important period. But sooner or later, of course, we are supposed to be divided because just we need political competition, and then we'll be political, I would say, opponents to each other. But it's normality. That's why just we say just there is no need to have unity of all political groups, because just it's only necessary for revolution. But we already fed up of revolutions. Russia already just had too much revolutions in the last century. That's why we our goal is to prevent such development.
Kristiina, is there concern? And I'm going to turn to the audience in just a minute. Is there concern in Brussels and Tallinn that the alternative to the current system, the alternative to Putin, say, is not the man sitting to your right, but it's somebody like Dmitry Rogozin?
Yes, this is
ultra-nationalists.
This is about democracy, but this is, well, at the same time, it may happen, yes. It may happen that the communists, let's imagine that you get Putin and his regime out of the scene, and through the democratic elections, the communists will take over, for example, or the nationalists led by Rogozin. Then this will be another political reality, and the leftist movement led by a young man in Russia, Mr. Udaltsov, who is getting more and more how to say, popular. This may become a reality one day, but at the same time, I believe that the liberal democratic forces will keep that in mind, of course, and do their best to convince Russian people what is the best for the country. And once again, that from Europe, definitely these liberal forces will get strong, at least moral support to get through their goals and to bring this country back on the democratic track.
But should Western support for civil society and the opposition not only be geared to trying to change the current system, but focus on trying to prevent an ultra-nationalist force coming to power?
Yeah, but you see, we have seen during the Putin's regime also bad things happening, and no improvement. Even if you put it like this, that if we have a choice between Putin and communist, which is worse? well, look at Putin. He went to the war with Georgia in 2008. There was no sort of guarantee that nothing like that could happen. We haven't seen any kind of readiness from Putin's regime to resolve this Georgian conflict. Still, a part of Georgia is occupied by Russia. There are still long-lasting conflicts in South Caucasus. Take the occupation of Azerbaijan by Armenia, which is very much supported and backed by Kremlin power, or Transnistria. So, well, I wouldn't say that Putin is a priori better than the communists could
Estonia was the target of a cyber attack, a major cyber attack. So
yes, in 2007.
Right.
Yes, you're right. Exactly. The Estonia, well, experienced I think the so far world's biggest and strongest cyber attack in 2007, and that was also in time when Putin's regime was just growing and strengthening.
great. All right, the soft questions are over. I'm going to.
I don't dream about just communists coming to the power. In fact, they're saying just to grab everything for everyone and to divide again. That's the dream they have.
Let me. Do we have microphones? Yeah. Okay. So if we could, the woman right there, and then we'll. If you could identify yourself, please tell us who you are, and
Thank you.
Keep your questions relatively short.
My name is Jelena. I'm from Serbia. I'm fighting for human rights and democracy in Serbia and Balkan with other people, other young people. I have two questions actually. The first question is, do you think that international organizations can help us? Because in Serbia, I think we were on a really good way, but now things changed after international organizations was there. So do you think that they can help us for democracy and human rights in Balkan? And the other question is, in Serbian media, Russia is presented like our friend, Orthodox brothers, and everything like the best. But my question is, why didn't you put veto when they bombed us? I mean, it's like.
All right, let's divide these questions. Maybe Kristiina, you take the first, and you've got responsibility for the second. Why didn't you?
Yes, Balkans in general. Again, I think that any kind of improvement of democracy in Balkans is, in my view, very much related with the European perspective, the perspective to joining European Union. This is what I mean. And I think this comes from the practices from the other Central Eastern European countries when, let's say, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and totalitarian regimes in Europe in the beginning of 90s and end of 80s, we had in that time immediately a very clear European perspective, joining transatlantic organizations like NATO and EU, and that immediately made our political leaderships very much willing and keen to go through reforms, different reforms, structural reforms, economic reforms, and of course very much the reforms of the democratic institutions, to building up the democratic institutions. And I think that this unfortunate history of 90s in Balkans, of course, postponed that much this European perspective, and the hope among people has been hope of the future, a better future, has been very different in different countries. And I've visited myself several Balkan countries about more than 1 year ago, and especially, for example, if you take Bosnia-Herzegovina, it's still the country with a very open future, I would say. And those people, including young people and also young people in Serbia, I believe that now after the concrete steps towards the European Union are also helping the youth and people in Serbia to become more optimistic about their future, but still there are some very serious unresolved issues in Balkans in general, and the security situation is also in certain parts rather fragile.
Veto?
At that time, there was no opportunity to have veto. You remember that it was done in a different manner, not through the Security Council. And at that time, I was not Prime Minister yet. At that time, there was a communist government in power. Mr. Primakov was Prime Minister, but in fact, to say frankly, just Russian people were always with sympathy to Serbia, and continue to take place now. And maybe we even remember just during that conflict, many of so-called Russian patriots were just fighting together with Serbs there. But the issue is that the regime of Milosevic regime at that time was beyond of all those imagination of what is could happen in this world. And that's why just pressure on him and punishment was inevitable. And even Russian mediators tried to build up an exit and way out of such situation. But Milosevic didn't implement any promises at that time. Of course, a majority of Russians, till now, majority of Russians continue to believe that it was wrong decision to bomb Belgrade, and that's why majority were against that. But still, the problem existed at that time was evident. And how to tackle that problem at that time, international community didn't know, but genocide took place. And how to stop that? That's what, of course, that is already part of the history. And just we can continue to provide arguments what was better, just or would have been better just at that time. But in fact, Russian government at that time and Russian people were against such a development which took place. But we also were against the genocide there. Whether the decision was wrong or not, but just we all had to stop those developments. Now just we continue to be big friends.
All right, I'm going to, there's quite a few hands here. I'm going to take 3 questions at a time, so write them down. And so second row behind, and then right here, okay?
Thank you. My name is Ingvild. I'm from Norway, and my question is about the EU. As you said, the efforts of the European Parliament is dependent of the member state governments. And I was wondering if the bilateral relationships with the members between the members of the European Union and Russia will affect their decisions, and how do you think that this effort will pass, or do you think it will fail in a way because of economical relationship between member state governments and Russia? Thank you.
Thank you. Right behind you.
Hi, I'm Patesh from AC Nation Radio. The question I have is as follows. In 1917, it's been said that Russia was ready for democracy. Instead, they received autocracy. In 1991, they were given democracy, but it really wasn't, and they have continued on a path of autocracy. Now the parties are United Russia and the KPRF, the current tyrants versus the previous tyrants. Because this autocracy has been so entrenched, is there really a hope for democracy to emerge from this, especially with the destruction of smaller and weaker parties?
Okay, and right here in the front row.
Thank you. Hi, my name's my name's Kitty, and I'm from the Green Party of Sweden. I'm going to be a bit provocative, but I think that the Magnitsky Bill is a really great initiative and a good start that might be able to irritate Putin and his supporters. But what is concretely, realistically needed for Vladimir Putin to step down from power in Russia? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Mikhail, go ahead. Why don't you start? Whichever one of those or any of them you want. And
It's very simple to answer. Not simple, but it's clear how to answer your question, what's needed. In fact, we understood during the last 6 months, we understood as a result of protests on the streets in Moscow and other big cities, we understood that Mr. Putin understands the language of street pressure. That's why even now, for us, as I said, just we're against revolution and against just violations on such kind of pressure, but we understand that street pressure is absolutely necessary. But simultaneously, we're offering publicly, describing to Mr. Putin's team just what is the peaceful way to get out. It means a round table, to sit down with opposition and civil society representatives and discuss terms and conditions of departure. First, political reform, I mean political freedom and competition. Secondly, free elections under control of civil society, and just transformation. That is our way. Just we have examples, in fact. Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and that time just when the Soviet Union collapsed and just those bloc disappeared, they gone this way. Of course, we don't want just to have such a development like Romania had with Ceausescu, or other things just on the recent Arabic countries. We don't want that. But these people should understand that there is a peaceful way, and this policy couldn't continue anymore. But what we need, pressure and reasonable, with arguments, political activity, so that not simply say Putin to jail, like some people, of course, had the right to say on the demonstrations, but to show these people that they should stop. They should stop this policy and should respect Constitution, and they should peacefully depart. On those mechanisms exist in Constitution. It means free elections.
The second question was about hope for democracy.
On a trend on democracy,
Yeah,
whether
right.
Russians are prepared for democracy. I think that is a wrong perception that Russians are not prepared for democracy, as Senator Cardin described, for instance, human rights, which is a considerable part of democracy. That is universal values, and they shouldn't be given time to autocratic regime just gradually to provide human rights priority in the country. Simply stop violations, that's all. Just implement laws and constitution and give rights to all citizens. That's very, very easy to do. But the issue is it's overall understanding. You mentioned that now just exist only two parties, Единая Россия and KPRF. That is KPRF, a communist party. In fact, that is inherited from Soviet Union. That's why you're right. They strong in their regional network, because just same people who were in the Soviet Union continue to believe they are right people, and that was disaster that Soviet Union disappeared, and then continue actively to participate in the activity. But in fact, that's the core electorate of Communist Party. That's something like 8%. They're getting 15%, and including the protest voting, which they got 18%, something like that. But in fact, Kristiina also mentioned just that liberals should get more. And remember that, of course, we know well just what is the structure of people's priority, people's choice could be. In fact, the Democrats, like our party, could get 25%, which is a lot. Because just these people who now vote for Единая Россия, for Putin's party, these people would immediately change their mind as soon as they understand that competition exists and it is possible to have a choice. Because right now, Единая Россия, that's not a political party. That is association of bureaucrats and loyal businessmen. There is no ideology which unite these people. And in fact, these people are looking for a normal development of the country, which is democratic status of the state and market economy. Of course, regulated by the state market economy. State not participate in a competition in the economy, but have strong regulation, clear and applicable for everyone. That's their understanding of, I think, 25–30% of people. If it's the case, that's a completely different story. Of course, nationalists will get like 12%, something like that, and communists like 10–15% too. But that is already the full spectrum of political priorities of people. That is absolutely inevitable. We should go through that. Yes, maybe that would be a coalition government, but we should go through that.
Kristiina, on the EU question.
Yes, the first question, the short answer will be yes. of course, they will try to influence not only the governments but also the members of European Parliament, I'm sure, and perhaps even here in US they are working hard. The diplomats of Russia are working hard to avoid this legislation, and well, they have different possibilities how to influence the governments, because some governments are more pro-Putin in Europe, but they are Putin's friendly governments inside EU. Well, some governments are very pragmatically tied with Russia through these gas pipelines, and Europe has experienced what it means to be in cold in January in Austria or in Bulgaria, for example, a couple of years ago, or in Italy, yes. And then some countries who are just the neighboring countries, like Finland, for example, well, just Putin met recently, last week, I believe, with a new president of Finland, and very clearly warned him, not on Magnitsky's bill, but just warned again about the will of joining, possible will of joining NATO. Yeah. So it's there are different possibilities, but still I would say that as already we discussed here, that if one Schengen country will implement the visa sanctions, then the others should do the same. And the question is, who will be the right country who could do it first?
And then hopefully Norway would follow. Right there in the second row. We got a lot, and I don't want to discriminate against folks in the back because I'm actually starting to feel your pain. We'll
thank you very much. I'm Felipe from Lund, Sweden. My question is a little bit like Ms. Ojuland was saying, that it seems difficult that a unified Europe will agree anytime soon, if not impossible, on anything like the Magnitsky bill. So we're left then with more or less a statement from the United States, and in a way also a provocation. So I'm saying, is the Magnitsky bill really the best tool or mean to reach the goal? Instead of and being left with a more polarized United States and Russia relationship. Thank you.
The gentleman in back standing right there.
Thank you. Sebastian from Stockholm University. My question is
Seems to be a Swedish cabal here, I think.
So like in Sweden.
We're taking over.
I love Sweden. But
my question is relating to oil. As oil prices are going down and the Russian budget is getting more and more squeezed, is there a large risk of Putin becoming even more belligerent and suppressive of civil society that is more entrenched? Yes, that's my question.
Okay. Gentleman right here in the third row in the aisle. And then folks in back, if you put your hands up, if there's anybody there.
Thank you. My name is David Krivanek from the University of Geneva in Switzerland. My question is about the degree of centralization of the regime change, if you will. Could it also come from the local governors or from the smaller cities, or would it have to emerge in Moscow or St. Petersburg, maybe?
Okay. So is the Magnitsky bill the best way, particularly if there's a possibility Europe won't follow? Could Putin become more belligerent, and what about local governors and their role? Go ahead, Kristiina, why don't you start?
Well, yes, this, you also asked about the possible developments, relations between US and Russia after this, let's say, Magnitsky law will be adopted here, with the possible polarization. Well, I think that it would be better if somebody from the US would respond on this, but I think that here again, US and then Europe, we should work together, and I think it's very, very important that our delegation is here right now during the votes and discussion of this Magnitsky bill. And when I go back to the European Parliament, well, of course, I will share with my colleagues what I've been discussing here with the senators and congressmen, how to cooperate between EU and the US in order to, well, be firm on our position and not to allow to polarize the relations. And this is not only the question as the Norwegian girl asked about Russia's the Putin's regime behavior trying to divide the EU countries. Certainly we will see soon the attempts to polarize or to divide also EU and US on this Magnitsky law, or to play some EU countries against US more or less publicly against this Magnitsky law. So it's of course it's a political reality what we will probably experience in coming weeks and months, but the only thing is here to stand together, to be together, and to keep firm on our values, what we share between EU and the US.
Mikhail, before you answer the other questions, let me just, since I am the only American standing up here, like it or not, there's an extraterritorial nature to U.S. legislation. And that is to say, if we pass a visa ban on Russians coming here, that obviously only applies to the United States. But if we impose an asset freeze, that actually would apply to Western financial institutions that also do business in the United States or with Americans. Essentially, that means I'm not picking on one, a German bank who does business with one of these Russians on the list would have to choose, does that bank want to continue to do business with that Russian individual, or does that bank want to do business with the United States? So there is an extraterritorial nature to this. So even if there aren't European countries that would pass the legislation from the U.S. would still have an impact beyond the borders of the United States.
That's right. On that issue, just I also like to add that in fact we have enough of realpolitik, and in fact just we cannot. And you hear in the United States and in Europe, you cannot close your eyes. Just it's what's taking place in my country. Russia, as I mentioned already several times, and is a part of Europe. Russia is a part of civilized world, just being a member of OSCE and the Council of Europe. We have problematic government, a sick government. That's why just the appropriate criticism should be given to this government. And you always should bear in mind, just you have to divide Russian nation, Russian people, and the Russian Federation and this government, which doesn't want to implement constitution and international obligations. That's why I think just for American leaders, same as European Union leaders, that's absolutely appropriate to stay on values. They were elected because of their standing and devoted to values. If not, they will never be elected in their countries. Why they should treat Russia differently as a strange country? They should Russia from the same perspective as they do their business internally in their countries. Just human rights priority that's as high than any other state interest. That's why there is explanation and reason for such a absolutely normal attitude to have sanctions against individuals, but not the nation. Russian people adopted a constitution, which absolutely normal constitution of a democratic state. Why Russian people should be sanctioned? That's why Jackson-Vanik would be abolished, but individual sanctions would be applicable. As David just described, that is absolutely a practical effect. But every transaction in US dollar would be stopped because correspondent bank would never allow just the client bank just to make this transaction. That's for just practical purposes. On other things, oil, and whether Putin would be more harsh on just having problems in the budget. Of course, I think just that is the dilemma, which on this particular stage, he and his team should understand. If, I mentioned, if oil price fall down to $60 per barrel, it means like 8% deficit of federal budget. It means just all reserves Russia accumulated will disappear within half a year, 1 year maximum. And after that, just Putin couldn't implement social obligations contracted by himself. Because just since my departure, there was no single reform launched. And some of reform started by my government was stopped. Because Putin just tried to feed people by his hand. He simply increased pensions without any reforms. He simply increased salaries to militaries without reform of army. And secret services growing, and bureaucracy growing. Just by 2 million people, just bureaucracy will grow. But more than 100% since I departed the government. Just quantity of bureaucrats, local, regional, and federal, increased just by 100%, doubled. And all these people just demand money. And increased, just higher than average in the country. For that, just everything, just oil money used. But in this case, that is the end of the story of Putin's regime. If oil price fall down for 60 and stays for half a year, that's why he understands that. But he dreams that some kind of conflicts, which he doesn't want to perform appropriately together with international society to stop those regional conflicts, and especially in the Middle East. That conflicts will raise the oil price and keep it high. That's why this is external policy subordinated to internal goals to keep power, and all methods just applicable from his perspective. That's why we cannot treat this policy as responsible policy, because just the goals are different, motivation is different. That is the problem of this regime. There's a problem not only for us Russians, but for our friends in Europe and just the whole world, including the Middle East. We have just how people in Syria suffer already for a year, just thousands and thousands of people were killed because of blockage of this important resolution. Another point, just where just the growing changes from which place could start, regions or Moscow. In fact, Moscow and St. Petersburg, Nizhny Novgorod, big cities with the population more than, say, 5 million people. That's where the concentration of middle class. At least that is what we dream to have this a peaceful. So middle class depress the regime, but not simply, leftist organizations. That's why that's important. These people continue to stay strongly, and we have very, I would say, effective internet society, and people every day communicate and exchange their views, and that works. But in the local governments, there are a lot of people, of course, who are reasonable enough. They work for the governments if they were appointed simply because of their career or because of the necessity to have job. But some, even in this regime, sometimes it is happened that people in the municipal councils could be elected. Just not everything under concrete, not everything blocked by Putin. That's why just some people already starting just raising their voices. Even in the Federal Duma, we have the thought that just everything only Putin's nominee, but 3 persons appear there just out of 450, but 3 persons who saying just right things from time to time. That a little growing protest there, just in a different level of governments, but it still exists something. But and I mentioned to you, just even some ministers approaching to me just in these difficult days, understanding that the end of the story just coming. And that's why they would like somehow to escape. But it's not possible for escape from this team, because it's a closed circle. And Putin doesn't allow any minister to escape just from the job. He immediately appoints one or another person just as an assistant or as a counselor, etc. So they will be under control of the whole machine. But these people understand that Putin cannot defend them, and just that he's doing wrong things already for a long period of time, and the collapse of the regime is inevitable. That's why they're looking. That's why just the delusion of the whole system started. People started already describing their desire to escape, and some of them do that.
Okay, we'll take 3 more questions. We still have a lot of hands. I'm going to go on the back. Those 2 folks there, if we have a mic. Yep, right there. And then the person sitting kind of in front of you.
Hello, my name is Maria Persverikova. I'm with Russian International Affairs Council. And my question is on the future of the street protest. Just from what I'm observing now, these protests are just dying out. And it's not just so many people out in the streets nowadays as it was straight after the elections. And do you think really these street protests can become the driving force of democratic changes? And what actually the opposition should do to make sure its voice is heard? What are the other tools that the opposition can use, apart from just bringing people to the streets?
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think, yes, right there, right? And then there was, yes, and then over there. Go ahead.
Susan King from the National Democratic Institute. I have a question for Mikhail Kasyanov. You mentioned that there was a reform of political party registration requirements that went into effect April 4th of this year. And indeed, that has caused an explosion, if you will, of political parties being registered in Russia. Currently, there are 21 political parties registered last time I checked, and up from 7 that were effective before this legislation went into place. So I'm wondering what it is that you see as being essential support for these political parties that are emerging in Russia to be successful. Thank you.
And then, yes, right there.
Thank you. Thank you. I work for International Foundation for Electoral Systems. My question is like a follow-up question for a previous one. So how sustainable are the anti-Putin protests, and what's the potential of the middle-class demonstrators in pushing for democracy? Recently, we've observed some efforts from the youth leaders to renew their agenda by consolidating liberals and nationalists to work together as a unified front. So would you envision those protesters as the key agent for democratic transition in the near future? Thank you.
Okay. 2 protest questions and a political party question. Yeah, I do want to, these may be a little more for you, Mikhail, but I want to hear the European perspective. Is there a sense that the protests are dying out and therefore Europeans will fall back into their same patterns? But we'll start with you. Go ahead.
I'll start with protests, yes, so that Kristiina could comment on that. I cannot agree with what you're saying, just the protests are dying. In the 12th of June, there were just more people than before. And the 6th of May, there were more people than before. Just it was even surprise for us, for organizers of those protests, that more people appeared on the streets. In February, there were more than 100 people on the streets. And in May, people predicted will be only 20,000 people, but appeared more than 100. And in June too. That's the first point. The second point, of course, we have, just as I said, de facto coalition on the street. Rights, leftist organization, left, center-left, center-right, and right parties or organizations on the street. But that is important instrument, as I said. There should not be a special unity as one organization, because it's wrong perception. Some people, yes, calling for that. But it's wrong and only for those people who believe only in one way, revolution. We are against that. That's why the process should exist and will continue to play an important role of consolidating and asking middle class to appear in the streets, so that to have a real pressure to this regime. Simultaneously, working with the population and to have a usual political job to interact with people and explain to them just our views on the future, and to explain to them what's taking place, what's happening in the country now, and what the reasons of those problems taking place in the country. Now just switching on the reform. In fact, political reform announced in December, and they say implemented. That's absolutely an imitation. They did nothing, just very little. Just all new legislation exists, and talking about registration of new political parties. In fact, that only 2 or 3 of them, that's real political groups, people want to form their association. All others, that's imitation instructed by Kremlin. That's again to provide a new picture for people. You people wanted freedom, that's the freedom. 200 parties exist, now just let them fight to each other. But that's another way of imitate the political pluralism. It's not the case. That's why I'm again saying, just out of 100 applications already provided to the Ministry of Justice to register political parties, only 3, I think, 2 or 3, there are real. All others imitation of different people working under instruction of authorities. That's what I think that we have.
Perfect timing. Perfect timing. Let me thank Mikhail and Kristiina for a terrific panel discussion here. And I'm going to turn it over to my dear friend Ellen Bork from Foreign Policy Initiative to introduce Senator Ayotte.
Hi, I'm Ellen Bork. I'm the Director of Democracy and Human Rights at the Foreign Policy Initiative, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Senator Kelly Ayotte of New Hampshire. She was elected by the people of New Hampshire in 2010, prior to which she served as Attorney General under Republican and Democrat administrations. She calls herself a prosecutor at heart, and we have seen that kind of spirit as she's tackled lots of foreign policy and defense issues since joining the Senate. In the Senate, she's a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and in particular the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Readiness and Management. She has emerged as a serious critic of Vladimir Putin's foreign policies, in particular with regard to Syria. She also pays attention to Russia and that region in her capacity as a member of the Helsinki Commission. We have worked with her very closely since her arrival in Washington and look forward to doing so again. We're so pleased to welcome her today.
I want to thank you so much, Ellen. I want to thank the Foreign Policy Initiative and Freedom House for hosting today's important event. This event could not be more timely. It's an honor to share this forum with Senator Cardin as well, who I know has already spoken to you, who played such an important leadership role on the Magnitsky legislation. I'm a proud co-sponsor of that legislation, and without Ben Cardin's tenacity, that piece of critical legislation would not have passed out of the Foreign Relations Committee yesterday. And I also want to recognize the former Prime Minister as well as Ms. Ojuland. It is an honor to be here with you as well. With Secretary Clinton's visit this week, I would like to take a broader view of democracy in Russia and encourage different strategic thinking about United States and Russia relations. The Obama administration from the beginning approached Russia as if the strains in the relationship between the United States and Russia were the fault of the prior administration's approach to Russia. As if the Putin government's uncooperative actions on Iran and other issues resulted from justifiable Russian resentment against U.S. policy. As a result, President Obama has pursued an accommodating policy toward Mr. Putin, embarking on what he called a new approach to Russia in his reset policy. However, an honest examination of reset would have to lead you to the conclusion that this new approach has not resulted in a more beneficial relationship between Russia and the United States. There has not been a change for the better or enough change on Russia's policies toward Iran, North Korea, missile defense, democratization, or other matters of concern to the United States of America. And any fair-minded analyst has to conclude that reset has been a failure, and I hope that the administration takes a new approach. The state of relations between our two governments exists despite concessions which could be much better, despite concessions by the Obama administration as part of a broader strategy of the United States accommodation toward the Kremlin. In an effort to appease the Kremlin's concerns in his first year in office, President Obama abandoned U.S. plans to deploy U.S. NATO missile defenses in Europe, despite the fact that it was clear that the short and medium-range missile defenses pose no threat to Russia's much larger arsenal. In 2010, brushing aside the continued Russian occupation of Georgia, President Obama pushed through the controversial civil nuclear trade agreement with the Russians that had previously stalled because of Russia's assistance to Iran in their nuclear program and missile programs, as well as Russia's August 2008 invasion of Georgia. The Putin government has given the reset a brush-off through its actions in Syria, a rebuff of U.S. missile defense initiatives, continued occupation of the Georgian territory, and anti-democratic treatment of the Russian people. In Syria, despite Assad's brutal response to peaceful demonstrations with a systematic campaign of killing that has resulted in the deaths of 10,000 men, women, and children, President Putin has continued to support and provide weapons to the Assad regime. Russians' arm transfers and in opposition to the UN Security Council resolutions regarding Syria have enabled Assad to remain in power and, unfortunately, to continue to murder his own people. In the area of missile defense, the Kremlin's response has been equally disappointing. The United States and NATO have sought to develop a European missile defense shield to defend against potential ballistic missile threats from Iran. While this system could not defend against a Russian nuclear missile attack and therefore does not impact the Russian nuclear deterrent, Russian civilian and military leaders have responded with threats of preemptive attacks rather than a cooperative discussion so that our mutual interests could be advanced. The Obama administration's reset has also not elicited Russian concessions with respect to the country of Georgia. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia with Russian troops, and they continue to occupy. And that's unfortunate. And finally, in terms of human rights, an issue that I know is of concern to every single person in this room, unfortunately, Russia's gone backwards in terms of human rights. Freedom House's 2012 Freedom in the World rankings categorizes Russia as not free. On a scale of 1 to 7, with 7 being the most oppressed, Freedom House gives Russia a 5 for civil liberties and a 6 for political rights. Mr. Putin and his allies have come to dominate the Russian media. Opposition groups are frequently denied the opportunity to register and have been targeted for raids. The death of Sergei Magnitsky and the case of Mikhail Khodorkovsky are two prominent examples of a broad and deeply troubling trend. There are many other examples that have not received as much international attention, but are yet still as compelling as the two examples that prompted the Magnitsky legislation. And to better understand the authoritarian character of the Putin government, one needs only to examine what Putin says and the company that Mr. Putin keeps. Mr. Putin makes a practice of speaking contemptuously about democracy, democratic activists, and journalists. He has also aligned the Russian government closely with the despotic regimes in Syria, in Iran, Nicaragua, North Korea, and Venezuela. You are a reflection of the company that you keep. It is time for the Obama administration to rethink its strategy toward Russia and to move to one that is less aligned with Mr. Putin and more aligned with achieving the mutual interests of the Russian and American people. And we have many, many mutual interests. America's interests are not in building up Mr. Putin's personal prestige through arms control signing ceremonies and through deference in the United Nations Security Council, where Mr. Putin can wield his veto and has not hesitated to do so in egregious cases like Syria. A wise United States policy toward Russia would align with those enlightened Russians who want what is truly best for their own country and for their people. Policies that would make Russia stronger economically, more secure, more humane, more respected, and more democratic. That is why it is important to support Russia's accession to the World Trade Organization, but also in conjunction to allowing Russia in the World Trade Organization to also passed the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act of 2012, so that a more prosperous, transparent Russia that is more integrated with the global economy, which is in Russia's interests, but will also respect the human rights of Russians. However, it is also in the interests of our two countries and our two peoples to stand with the Russian people and support their efforts to achieve the rights that we enjoy in the United States of America, including the right to have a government that represents their interests and does not target peaceful demonstrations and activists with violence and imprisonment. When Mr. Putin's government abuses peaceful Russian activists and protesters, we should hold them accountable by naming and shaming the culprits. That is the purpose and the power behind the Magnitsky legislation, and that is why I am so pleased that the Senate Foreign Relations Committee passed that legislation yesterday. But it is also why I'm concerned that an amendment was included to provide for a classified annex to that legislation. I don't know what's classified about violating human rights. I can't understand that. And I respect the attempts that were made by members of the committee to scrutinize the decisions in terms of who would go on the classified annex and to make it more difficult for the administration to add names to the classified annex. That's certainly a step in the right direction. But if the purpose of the legislation is to hold the Putin government accountable for the shameful abuses of the Russian people as highlighted by what happened to Sergei Magnitsky in that prison where he was tortured and killed, then hiding the names of the culprits on a classified annex directly undercuts the power of the Magnitsky legislation. And so I will certainly support this legislation, and I hope that it comes forward very quickly to a full vote before the United States Senate, conditioned on the WTO admission. The two should go together. But this classified annex issue, I'm really at a loss to understand what is classified with those who violate human rights, like the individuals who were responsible for murdering Sergei Magnitsky. Unfortunately, I'm disappointed that the Obama administration has opposed the Magnitsky legislation from the beginning, instead of championing this legislation. And I hope that they change their position on this and that the president comes forward and champions this important legislation. I fear that the administration will attempt to use this classified annex to undercut the intent and effectiveness of the Magnitsky legislation. And again, I plan to support this on the floor, but please know, if it's passed with this classified annex, there will be those of us in Congress watching very, very carefully what happens with that annex to make sure that it is not used to hide individuals within the Putin administration or the Russian government who are torturing and murdering people. The United States has immediate interests that are aligned with Russia, and there are so many ways that we can cooperate together. For example, a large portion of the equipment for our troops in Afghanistan travels along the Northern Distribution Network, which connects Afghanistan with the Baltic, Caspian ports via Russia, Central Asia, and the Caucasus, and this is very, very important to our battle in Afghanistan. Since the closure of the ground supply routes through Pakistan in 2011, the United States has relied even more heavily on the Northern Distribution route. And we wouldn't want to see the simultaneous closure of the Northern Distribution Network and the supply routes through Pakistan. So this is an important area of United States-Russian cooperation. Also, we would like to see more cooperation from Russia in preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon and in opposing the development of North Korea's nuclear weapon capabilities. Russia has interests as large as those of the United States in opposing the proliferation of nuclear weapons and long-range missiles. But the Putin government often acts as if we don't share those interests. It acts as if it is more important to counter the United States' influence in that area of the world rather than to advance our common interests in non-proliferation. This seems to gratify Mr. Putin, but it certainly doesn't help us or the Russian people. In light of this dilemma, it is important to return to the basics and review 5 axioms I believe should guide the United States policy toward Russia. First, the Cold War is over, thankfully, and we have no interest in reviving it. Second, Russia is not the Soviet Union. The latter was an ideological enemy of the United States of America, which we aim to defeat. Russia is a country that we would be happy to see prosper and become a strong, respected member of the international community like Germany, Japan, and other former enemies of the United States of America. Third, the United States and Russia share major national security interests. Fourth, Putin's interests are not necessarily those of the Russian people. In fact, they're often directly at odds. Fifth, and finally, we do not reduce the likelihood of conflict with Russia by accommodation to Mr. Putin and by reducing our military capabilities in the field of missile defense or elsewhere. Russia has a serious national security interest in managing the rise of China, as do we, addressing Islamist extremism, as do we, preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, as do we, and creating an economic and business environment that encourages investment in Russia from U.S. companies and mutual economic relations that will benefit both of our economies. Yet, in all of the examples that I just cited of our mutual interest, Mr. Putin is pursuing policies that directly undercut the Russian interests I just identified. The Russians have a strong interest in creating an economic and business environment integrated with the global economy that encourages investment in Russia and helps to grow the Russian economy. Yet Mr. Putin has not tolerated, if not encouraged corruption within the Russian government and lack of the rule of law that directly undercuts these economic interests of the Russian people. You can look at the Corruption Perception Index from Russia. You can look at the World Bank's Doing Business survey. It's all incredibly negative. But let's get down to some basics. If you're in a situation where the businessman gets raped and his lawyer gets murdered, capital's not going to come to Russia if those are the conditions upon which business leaders are treated in that country, as exemplified by the Sergei Magnitsky situation. And so the more we have rule of law in Russia, the less corruption there is, and the more respect for human rights, the more the Russian economy will thrive and grow, and we can work together for our mutual interests. In the past decade, under Mr. Putin's leadership, Russia's dependence on oil has increased dramatically. Mr. Putin would rather concentrate on drilling for oil and gas, which has certainly been a very positive impact on the Russian economy, but he has not also focused his attention on the skills and education of the Russian people and the abilities of the Russian people. Instead, he chooses to make sure that the oil and gas revenue directly benefits a small clique of loyalists within the regime rather than more broadly support in a fair way all of the Russian people. This myopic approach to energy exports in lieu of genuine economic and democratic reform that would fully unlock the potential of the Russian people has worked well for Mr. Putin personally. However, it has not put the Russian economy on a sustainable path, given the fact that Russia's oil output is projected to reach a plateau from the middle of this decade onward, and that he has benefited from the high oil prices. Allow me to cite one more example to highlight what I believe is the difference between Mr. Putin's interests and the Russian people. Russia has a strong national security interest, which I've mentioned, in preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. If Iran acquires a nuclear weapon, the Iranian regime will become more aggressive toward its neighbors. In time, Russia is at least as likely as the United States to come into a confrontation with a nuclear-armed Iran. Russia and Iran are close to one another geographically. Both have significant and often conflicting interests in the neighborhood. And Russia has tense relations with its predominantly Muslim neighboring states in the south. It is not at all far-fetched to imagine Russia and an emboldened, nuclear-armed Iran coming into conflict with one another, perhaps even in a place like Azerbaijan. Despite Russia's strong national security interest in preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, Mr. Putin has served as the single most important enabler of the Iranian nuclear program. While Mr. Putin visited Israel this week, his policy has been to undercut attempts to address Iran's as well as North Korea's nuclear misbehavior at the UN Security Council. Mr. Putin short-sightedly views the Iranian nuclear program as a way to oppose the United States, yet he is helping to create a beast in his own backyard that one day will be as likely to bite Russia as it will be to bite the United States of America. While turmoil in the Middle East keeps oil prices high and benefits Putin, with his narrow focus on Russia's oil and natural gas exports, the strategic interests of the Russian people are not fully served and are not served at all by an Iranian nuclear weapons capability and all the harm that that may spawn. The type of error Mr. Putin is making regarding Iran has historical precedent. In the wake of World War I, there were two international pariahs in Europe, the defeated Germans and the Bolsheviks in Russia. The Versailles Treaty placed arms control restrictions on the Germans. Yet the Bolsheviks, in a move they no doubt believed to be a clever way to stick their thumb in the eye of Western powers, helped the Germans evade the arms control restrictions of the Versailles Treaty. The Russians helped the Germans with training and testing of war materials, specifically airplanes, poison gas, and tanks. This Russian cooperation was part of the Rapallo diplomacy, a reference to the 1922 treaty between the Soviet Union and Weimar Germany. Not many years later, Russia, more than any other country, suffered at the hands of the Nazis, whose war machine the Russians helped create. It is estimated that between 20 and 30 million Russians died in World War II. The Russians once again played a dangerous game by protecting and cooperating, are doing the same, I worry, by cooperating with Iran. And I would hope that they would see the error of their ways. In conclusion, Russia, while still a significant power with a major nuclear weapons arsenal, no longer represents the ideological or military threat to the United States that the Soviet Union did. Russia's conventional military forces, while still substantial, are far inferior to the Soviet military. Similarly, Russia confronts a major demographic crisis that presents a significant threat to Russia's long-term military and economic power. All of this can be improved and changed if Mr. Putin will do what is right for the Russian people. Yet in the phrase we use to discuss Russia, in the negotiations we engage in and the treaties that we enact in this country, we act as if Russia sometimes is still the Soviet Union. When we do this, we give Mr. Putin a gift and play right into his hands. When we appropriately condemn Putin's policies in Syria and Georgia, and when we call attention to the poor state of human rights and transparency in Russia, we must speak forcefully and put the blame where it belongs, at the feet of Mr. Putin. That is exactly what the president did not do with Mr. Putin at the G20 summit this month in Mexico. In fact, the dialogue with Putin at the G20 summit represents a perfect example of why I hope that the Obama administration will rethink its reset policy and why it is not the right approach toward Russia. The Obama-Putin dialogue in Mexico was a critical opportunity for the United States to lead and advance our national interests and to help the Syrian people. Mr. Obama should have called on Mr. Putin to end Russian arm shipments to Syria and to join the international community in calling for Mr. Assad to leave power. Sadly, the president did not push Mr. Putin on this issue. Instead, President Obama and Mr. Putin issued a joint statement that failed to even mention Mr. Assad, ignored Russia's continued military support for the illegitimate regime, and the statement that they did issue had no indication that we were calling on Russia to stop their arms shipment. It was very disappointing. And it portrayed the Assad military and the opposition as morally equivalent. And I don't believe that the Assad regime and the opposition are morally equivalent in any way. This lack of moral clarity in the United States leadership at a critical moment can only be viewed as a tragic and major missed opportunity. And unfortunately, I think another indication that we need to rethink our policy toward Russia. America is not and should not be anti-Russian. The Russian people deserve our support, our respect, and our cooperation. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and other senior Russian officials have described the Magnitsky legislation as anti-Russian. The truth is just the opposite. We serve the Russian people and United States national security interests when we speak up for human rights in Russia and condemn Mr. Putin's foreign policies that make Russians and Americans less safe. And we must make clear that America welcomes a strong and prosperous Russia that plays by the international rules, that promotes peace and stability, and respects the human rights of the Russian people and those around the world. I thank you so much for having me today at this very important conference.
Senator Ayotte, thank you very much. That was a terrific bipartisan bookend to the beginning of our conference with Senator Cardin. Please also again join me in thanking Mikhail, Kasyanov, and Kristiina Ojuland, and thanks to Foreign Policy Initiative and my team at Freedom House. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. Meeting adjourned.